Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Ange Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 4 running back rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses have been giving up the most points to opposing running backs thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format in order to give ourselves more insight as to which running backs have the most advantageous matchups going into the week and why exactly we should be playing those running backs this upcoming week. Then after we talk about the matchups portion of today's episode, we'll then transition to our top 36 running back rankings, as I'll share with you guys statistics in order to justify the reasons as to why I have my running back rankings as such and how I think the position is going to stack up when it's all said and done at the end of week 4. Before we begin today's video, I want to thank you guys for supporting the channel. If you have not yet already, of course, be sure to subscribe. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the season for the singular goal of trying to help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship. Again, try to help us get to our goal of 70,000 subscribers. We're really close to that. Greatly appreciate it. Also, for those of you who haven't checked out Underdog Fantasy and are trying to find more ways to play fantasy football, perhaps you didn't draft enough teams this offseason, Underdog Fantasy provides more of an opportunity to have fun on a weekly basis and even get involved in matchups that you perhaps don't even have fantasy players participating in. Specifically, last night, we talked about on my Monday waiver wire episode a couple pick'em slips that I liked. Mainly, this was the one, talking about Noah Brown, Sterling Shepard, and Richie James all going higher on their overall reception total. We were able to hit on all three of those and find ourselves winning. And I went ahead and I was feeling myself a little bit before yesterday's game. I even saw David Sills added to this list, and I thought to myself, man, he plays a lot of snaps within this offense. Let's involve him in here. Unfortunately, only 3 legs of this higher or lower pick'em slip via Underdog Fantasy were able to be successful, but I was able to add the little shield mark, as you can see to the top right corner of this pick'em slip. It gives us an insurance policy, even if one of these legs don't meet, and David Sills was literally 1 yard off receiving. We're still able to come away with some money. I was excited about that. I even went as far as to participating into last night's contest between these two teams as I drafted a team, and Saquon Barkley to the right of me carried my squad, ended up getting me, a pretty nice penny out of it. Either way, go ahead, travel to Underdog Fantasy. There's a link down in the description. When you sign up using promo code Andrew, make a first-time deposit minimum of $10. You'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. So if you're interested, be sure to check that out. There's a link down in the description. Play the Pick'ems game, perhaps draft some best ball teams for the rest of the season, or participate in the weekend matchups and battle royales. All of that coming your way. If you're excited about it, check it out. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about our Week 4 running backs, beginning with matchups. As you can see immediately to the right of me, we have how many points defenses have given up to opposing running backs thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format in terms of all statistics combined. Rushing, receiving, touchdowns galore, everything encompassed into one singular graphic. As you can see, the Houston Texans, they have given up the most points to opposing running backs, while on the other end of the spectrum, on a per-week basis, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have been the best defense in terms of stopping running backs. Overall, we take this into account. We want to play players against the Houston Texans, Detroit Lions, Minnesota Vikings, Steelers, Chargers. These are teams that year over year, in the last 2 seasons, have been the worst in terms of stopping opposing running backs. I talk about it ad nauseum. There is a pattern of seeing these defenses perform, and even though they make some adjustments during the offseason, their base cores as a whole are primarily the same. And if you were once bad at stopping the run, you're going to continue to be bad at stopping said run. Now, speaking of stopping the run, let's go ahead and let's analyze these overall statistics at an even greater level. If we just go ahead and isolate rushing statistics allowed as of the first 3 weeks of the season thus far, we will find that the Houston Texans, Detroit Lions, Minnesota Vikings, Philadelphia Eagles, Pittsburgh Steelers, they still stay among the top of the league in terms of giving up fantasy points per week to opposing running backs. Now, what we have found over, tons of data and tons of analysis over the last couple of years is that receiving statistics alone isn't really going to go up or go down based on a matchup. But rushing statistics 100% are applied when we're talking about the difficulty or potential ease of a matchup in a given week. Nonetheless, hopefully the statistics give you a little bit more insight as to where we're going with our Week 4 matchups and why we are playing specific players. We'll refer back to these statistics as we progress throughout the video. Hopefully you like these statistics. If you do, be sure to click the like button down below. Greatly helps, support the channel. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about our Week 4 running back rankings, top 36. We'll try to go through these as quickly as I possibly can, but there's a lot of players to talk about. So here we go. Be sure to check out the timestamps. They're down in the description of the video if you're looking for a specific player, or you can go ahead and just swipe back and forth on the timeline of the video and find the specific player's name that you're looking for if you're interested. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about Saquon Barkley. He has officially overthrown Jonathan Taylor all season long has been the number one on every single running backs list that I have put forward. Now Saquon Barkley has the throne. Heavy is the head that wears the crown. He's got a lot to live up to, but luckily for him, he has an incredible matchup this upcoming week, taking on the Chicago Bears. In my opinion, this is a 5-star matchup. Of course, they've been giving up 15.5 fantasy points per week just on rushing statistics alone. Just this last week, we saw Dameon Pierce have himself an incredible rookie performance against that defense. You go back to week 2, even A.J. Dillon and Aaron Jones combined for 132 rushing yards and had himself a lot of receiving work themselves. 30.5 fantasy points between those two running backs in a singular matchup against the Chicago Bears defense. I think this is a perfect week for Saquon to continue to maintain at the top of the running back position, playing 92% of the offensive snaps just last night against the Dallas Cowboys. And based on the fact that the New York Giants are staying in, games, they're winning or at least keeping it close, it doesn't allow the game script to get away from Saquon Barkley. He's been able to run the ball and do so very effectively. 53 rushing attempts for 317 rushing yards thus far this season, a 5.98 yard per carry average. Of course, with the offensive line improved and the offense as a whole improved, thanks to the coaching overall, Saquon Barkley continues to maintain as the number one. Moving on to Jonathan Taylor. Speaking of, all right, Jonathan Taylor, you get to take on a division rival. Last season when he had an opportunity of taking on the Tennessee Titans, he put up 7.7 points in one contest and 19.7 in the other. Overall, when we look at Jonathan Taylor and his performances thus far this season, they have been relatively underwhelming, but just go back to 2021. Look at the first 3 weeks of Jonathan Taylor's season. He was the number 27 overall running back throughout that span of time. And if it wasn't for the fact that he eventually started getting into the end zone and the offense began to really give him like max levels of opportunities, he wouldn't have been able to break out and have such an incredible season. So that's what I'm purely anticipating. Yes, he has gotten himself great opportunity. 24 touches just this last weekend, but the touchdowns are going to arrive. And when they do, it is going to separate him from the pack once again like it did last year. I'm not too worried about the matchup. I know that the Tennessee Titans defense has been struggling in the back end, so it's going to be tough for them to be able to stack the box, especially if Matt Ryan, Michael Pittman Jr. show up and start making noise. Jonathan Taylor's a perfect play, and obviously you're starting him. Moving on to Derrick Henry. On the other end of this matchup, Derrick Henry had himself a huge bounce back week this last week against the Las Vegas Raiders. We anticipated that. Again, the Las Vegas Raiders defense has not been able to stop the run year over year, and this is going to continue to be the case. Even with Taylor Lewan out for the season, you guys got to remember, the year that Derrick Henry went for 2,000 rushing yards, Taylor Lewan was not there for majority of the season. That's the year that he tore his ACL. Derrick Henry, all he needs is this offense to be able to throw the ball effectively, be able to complete third and long situations so that when he is on the field, he is getting a lot of opportunity, especially in the running game. Now, we'll talk about his opportunity in the receiving game, but I want to mention last season when he took on the Indianapolis Colts, he had two performances, one 17.9 fantasy points and a half PPR, and the other 6.8. That 6.8 game was the game that he broke his foot and played through it. Just kind of putting it into perspective, just how tough this guy is. Nonetheless, like I was mentioning, the receiving work in which he is getting opportunity is definitely going to elevate his game. Last season, he was on pace for setting career highs in targets, receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns. Just this last week, he had himself 6 targets, 5 catches, 58 receiving yards. Overall, those are numbers that if he continues to even get remotely close to, we're seeing a different level of Derrick Henry, something that's very similar to what we experienced in 2021. And if that Derrick Henry's back, top 3 is at the very minimum for him. Moving on to Nick Chubb, our number 4. Nick Chubb has been absolutely incredible. He currently is the number 1 running back in a half PPR scoring format in terms of overall fantasy points and fantasy points per game, of course. He has been in a fantastic position, scoring 4 touchdowns already in just the last 2 games. But that all being mentioned, I do want to go ahead and give you guys a little bit more context. In that game this last week against the Pittsburgh Steelers, we all saw, if you were watching Thursday night, that there were 2 opportunities that Kareem Hunt had within the 5-yard line to run and get a touchdown. Unfortunately, he was not able to do so. Nick Chubb comes in, he gets the rushing attempt, he scores. Eventually, those touchdowns that Nick Chubb is really benefiting from right now are going to disappear. There are going to be games where Kareem Hunt, like in week 1, has 2 touchdowns overall, and it does hurt Nick Chubb. But overall, when we look at the matchup, in my opinion, versus the Atlanta Falcons, an advantageous one. But on top of the fact, we've been able to see Nick Chubb contribute 113 all-purpose yards every single game thus far this season. So 11.3 fantasy points just off of yards alone. If you accompany a touchdown, of course, you're getting into that 17-point total and above where he'll be fantastic. The reason why I think this is a great matchup, if you combine the total rushing yards of all the Seattle backs this last week, it combined for 113 total. I think there's a very good opportunity for this backfield to take advantage and Nick Chubb to have himself another fantastic week. Let's move on to Austin Ekeler taking on the Houston Texans. Though Austin Ekeler didn't have an opportunity of playing against the Houston Texans last year due to the fact that he was out in that game, Justin Jackson for the Los Angeles Chargers stepped up and absolutely had an incredible game in 2021 against that Houston Texans defense, having 30.2 fantasy points total. Just putting that into perspective, just how much of a better season Austin Ekeler would have had at the end of the 2021 year if he had participated in that game. Well, at least this year, he has the opportunity of doing so and potentially getting himself back on track. Let's not forget, Austin Ekeler has been awful. And I don't think many of us that are listening right now who have Austin Ekeler on roster are forgetting. You're actually quite probably mad. I understand. It is a natural reaction considering we were investing in him to be, once again, a top 4 running back. But the fact that he's getting 4 attempts, 5 rushing yards, 8 catches on 8 targets, 48 receiving yards, these are more, overall opportunities and numbers in terms of a scoreline that we're anticipating from Nyheim Hines or J.D. McKissic. These are not numbers that we're anticipating to see from Austin Ekeler. With the fact that Justin Herbert is dealing with his injury, the fact that Rashawn Slater, their all-pro left tackle going into his second year, is now out for the season, it is definitely going to hurt, but you take on the Houston Texans. It is the easiest matchup of the week, and there's no better way to get back on track than handing Ekeler the ball and letting him dominate against a soft run-stopping defense. Moving on to Christian McCaffrey. Listen, Christian McCaffrey has had himself back-to-back weeks of over 100 rushing yards. That's the first time he's been able to do that since late in 2019. So we're starting to see glimpses of Christian McCaffrey of old. The only difference maker purely is his overall receiving work. I mean, honestly, in terms of snap percentage, he played 80% this last Sunday. His rushing yardage and utilization and efficiency is at a pretty high level. But in terms of total receiving opportunity, Baker Mayfield is killing this offense. I mean, DJ Moore and Christian McCaffrey are not able to get anything done. Christian McCaffrey, 4 targets, 2 catches, and 7 receiving yards against the New Orleans Saints. That does not seem normal to me. So going forward, we have to keep this monitored because if you go back to 2021, in the games that he played healthy, full contests, he was getting an average of 7 receptions per game. Now he's only averaging about 3 receptions per game. Putting that into perspective, that is a huge drop-off in terms of overall reception points and receiving yards and potential receiving touchdown upside, which is a huge difference maker. We're expecting Christian McCaffrey to hopefully get back on track, especially against the Arizona Cardinals, but the receiving work has got to continue to accelerate. Otherwise, he's going to be left behind and be a lower-end RB1 as the season progresses. Moving on to our number 7, it is Jamaal Williams. I got to put respect in the name. Jamaal Williams, when he has been asked to step up and make plays, he has, purely. I mean, now that we have a potential in which DeAndre Swift is not going to be active, we have all of that consolidated opportunity into one singular back. And yes, Craig Reynolds is going to get himself some touches, but Jamaal Williams is going to be the guy. He has been a goal line back, and thus far this season, he's number 1 amongst all running backs in terms of rushing attempts inside the 10-yard line. 8 attempts for 3 rushing touchdowns. And as long as they're taking on an easy matchup, which they certainly are against the Seattle Seahawks, who had Cordarrelle Patterson go for a career-high 141 rushing yards against them. Whew, my goodness. Jamaal Williams is in a perfect position to succeed because we know this is a run-first offense. And we know that he's going to continue to get those goal line opportunities. Not only will he also get some more opportunity in the receiving game, but just this last week, 20 rushing attempts. If we're anything close to that number, I'm expecting a huge sum of fantasy points for us managers this upcoming week. Moving on to Alvin Kamara, our number 8. I understand that Alvin Kamara's performance this last week was quite disappointing, but what I do want to point out is that he has a great matchup against the Minnesota Vikings, who are giving up a lot of points to opposing running backs, and it's not by accident. Their defense did this last year and will once again do it this year. Now, the image that I've gone ahead and had on screen for Alvin Kamara is him on that Christmas Day performance in 2020. If you guys remember that day, he had one cleat that's green that you can see and the other one was red. And he was absolutely Santa Claus that day as he arrived and delivered a 6 rushing touchdown game against the Minnesota Vikings. That was the last time he took on this defense. Maybe there's an opportunity in which he's going to get himself running the ball downhill and putting up a huge sum of fantasy points for us. Mark Ingram, yes, vultured a touchdown, but I don't expect that to be the case going forward. We know that Alvin Kamara is a running back that they want to feature on all 3 downs, and Mark Ingram is going to get his touches, but this is going to be a 70%, snap percentage split in the favor of Alvin Kamara going forward I'm expecting him to get back on track this upcoming week. Let's not forget, thus far this season, the Minnesota Vikings defense, they've struggled against running backs. Week 1, the Packers running backs, 15 rushes, 94 yards, a rushing touchdown. Week 2, the Eagles, 23 rushing attempts, 106 rushing yards. Week 3, the Lions, 33 rushing attempts, 131 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns. A lot of potential here for Alvin Kamara to get back on track. Moving on to Khalil Herbert. Okay, listen, if in fact David Montgomery is going to be out, which we're anticipating considering he's not only dealing with an ankle injury, but also a knee injury, Khalil Herbert steps up and steps into a top 10 running back role against the New York Giants defense that has absolutely struggled against opposing running backs. Now, when we go back to last season, in the 4 full games that Khalil Herbert was the starting back of this team and got himself ample opportunity, this guy was averaging incredible overall touches, 19.5 rushing attempts per game, had himself 2.5 targets per game that led to 2.25 receptions per game. So overall, getting himself over 21 touches per game, 86 rushing yards per game, got himself a little bit of work in the receiving game last season. He has proven already in the past that he is capable of producing. And last week's performance of 29.9 fantasy points, number 1 amongst all running backs against Houston, I think that kind of just gives us a little bit of an indication as to what we should be potentially expecting. Of course, just this last night, we saw Pollard and Zeke put up 28 rushing attempts for 178 rushing yards and 1 touchdown against them. Christian McCaffrey the week prior, 102 rushing yards on 15 carries. In week 1, Derrick Henry still had himself a pretty decent game against that defense, 21 carries for 82 yards. Khalil Herbert, if this is going to be a run first and run only offense, you're going to be in a fantastic position to succeed this week. Let's move on to Najee Harris, our number 10, taking on the New York Jets. Pretty favorable matchup to say the very least. Again, the Jets have been one of these teams that have struggled. But I understand that many of you may be struggling with the idea that Jaylen Warren is getting more and more touches in this offense, but do not worry. Jaylen Warren is going to get himself 4 to 5 touches a game. That is perfectly fine. As long as Najee Harris continues to maintain 80% of the offensive snap count and 80% of the running back opportunity and touches, he is going to be in a perfect position to be the Najee Harris that we expect him to be. It's just a matter of whether or not this offense is going to be efficient enough to keep them in games. I think the matchup against the New York Jets is going to be a favorable one, especially considering Zach Wilson be on the other side of the field instead of Joe Flacco. This is going to be a contest that is going to be closer than people anticipate. I'm expecting to see Najee Harris get himself into that 20-plus touch opportunity range, and once he does, it's very easy for him to take one run and take it to the house. We know the kind of player he is. He just needs the opportunity to do so, and I'm expecting him to get that this week. Let's move on to Leonard Fournette. I understand that Leonard Fournette has been dealing with his hamstring injury in the last couple weeks, but they're not taking him off the field. He literally played 90.77% of the offensive snaps on Sunday against the Green Bay Packers. And though he didn't perform well, especially on the ground, it really doesn't surprise us considering the fact that they didn't really have to do anything but stop the run. That offensive line is banged up. The receiving corps did not have Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, or Julio Jones. If we are going to be undermanned, they're going to just stack the box and stop Leonard Fournette. But luckily for many of us, at least we saw Leonard Fournette get back on track in the receiving game. 5 catches, 6 total targets. That is something that is exciting going forward. He takes on the Kansas City Chiefs this week, a former Super Bowl matchup just a couple years ago. And in that game, Lombardi Lenny had himself 21.5 fantasy points, had himself an incredible performance, and brought home a huge W for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. There's a very good chance that they're going to kind of dip back into that bag, going up against a identical defense, same defensive coordinator, and try to go after the exact same points that they did a couple years ago through Leonard Fournette, running the ball and finding success. That's what I'm expecting. That's what we should anticipate. Moving on, we have number 12, Aaron Jones. To finish off our RB1 conversation, we have Aaron Jones here taking on the New England Patriots, who really have been one of the better teams in terms of stopping the run. They have been quite stout in that regard. But again, Aaron Jones is going to be able to get the majority of his work on the ground or even through the air. It doesn't really matter. But at this current moment, if you go back to last week's game and just take into account the fact that he had a reception that led him to the 1-yard line, and Vita Vea, the nose guard for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, dropped back into coverage and made the final hit to make Aaron Jones cough up the ball on the 1-yard line, there could have very easily been a 6 to 7 point fantasy swing. No, even more. A 9-point fantasy swing for Aaron Jones this last week. Instead of putting up 4.2, could have very easily had double-digit points. Now, unfortunately, that fumble did happen and we can't take it away, but we know he's going to continue to get opportunities. 16 this last week. And as long as A.J. Dillon is kind of sitting in that realm of not being so efficient in his rushing opportunities, Aaron Jones is going to continue to see work. Played 63% of the offensive snaps. I expect him to get back on track this week. All right, to recap our top 12 running backs for week 4 of the 2022 fantasy football season, these are the running backs that we have on screen, hopefully helping you guys designate which of these players that you are playing this week. Of course, if you have any of these guys on roster, we are going to start them to say the very least, but perhaps you have multiple. Maybe you went ahead and had the ability of picking up Jamaal Williams earlier this year or Khalil Herbert in terms of the waivers tonight. If you have these opportunities, check them out. This is for a half PPR. Rankings are subject to change. Be sure to join us Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, as we'll have up-to-date rankings on screen for the entirety of that 2-hour live stream for those of you who are interested. Thank you very much. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our number 13. It is James Robinson. James Robinson is currently the number 3 overall running back in a half PPR scoring format, averaging 17.77 fantasy points per game. Can you imagine that? If you had told me that just months ago, I wouldn't have believed you because this guy's coming off of an Achilles injury. But that being said, we believed that Cam Akers could come back and Cam Akers could find success. But at the rate in which, James Robinson's been able to do so already, and the amount of success he's already found is absolutely ridiculous. Now, I know this last weekend's performance against the Los Angeles Chargers was one-sided, but let's not forget, he is still getting 20 touches in that game. Had himself a 50-yard rushing touchdown where no one was even close to catching him. James Robinson is just a completely different monster, and I've never seen something like this before. Already this season, he has himself, 4 rushing touchdowns? Even if you were to take away his 4 rushing touchdowns from his stat total, he's still the number 27 overall running back because he is getting enough touches on the ground through the air to accompany his performance and elevate him to the next level. As of the last couple weeks, the Philadelphia Eagles run-stopping defense has been extremely brutal. Week 1, they gave up a bunch of points to the Detroit Lions running backs, but in the last 2 weeks, against Minnesota and against, of course, the Washington Commanders this past Sunday, they have only given up 77 rushing yards in those last 2 games. This may be a tough one for James Robinson, yet I do trust that he's got a lot of skill. He's going to get that opportunity, and if they get down to the goal line, we expect him to score. Moving on to Joe Mixon. From what I heard earlier today, head coach Zach Taylor mentioned that Joe Mixon should be expected to play on Thursday. That is concerning to me because it doesn't mean that he is expected to play the full-time role. There may be a split between him and Samaje Perine. And if that's going to be the case, this is brutally going to hurt many of our fantasy value because we're going to have to decide between the two. But if in fact Joe Mixon's available, again, he's a stud running back that needs to be in my lineup. And though he hasn't played like he did last year, there's a very good chance that he could end up on the 1-yard line punching it in multiple times because we've seen him do that in the past. Now, I do want to mention that the Miami Dolphins defense have been one of the best in the league in terms of stopping the run. They have been in this category for the last couple of years, and if it continues to be the same, it's going to be tough for them to get utilization. And if we're going to see a limited capacity from Mixon, it's going to be tough to start him, but nonetheless, we're going to keep him at the number 14 range because we know he's a stud RB1. He just needs to get the opportunity to find the end zone to reach that marker. Moving on to Dalvin Cook. Again, another one of these running backs that we're not too certain about in terms of the overall health going into week 4. He obviously dislocated his shoulder on Sunday. Now, if in fact he is going to be day-to-day, and maybe they end up allowing him to play with a brace on, the last time we saw him play with a brace on last season against the Pittsburgh Steelers, if you guys remember that game, Dalvin Cook had a monstrous performance. I think it was over 25 fantasy points. If we're anything in that realm of possibility where we're anticipating Dalvin Cook to play, I want him in my lineup because we know that they're going to give him the bulk majority of the touches in comparison to Alexander Mattison when they're both active. We've seen that last season when he was banged up with the shoulder. We've seen that this season. So that experience gives us, or at least lends us, some sort of insight as to where we can approach with this. Now, of course, the New Orleans Saints, they have played awful in terms of stopping the run as of late. Of course, the Carolina Panthers, Christian McCaffrey, over 100 rushing yards against them. Why not Dalvin Cook being able to do something very similar to it? We expected him to have a great week 3. He did prior to his injury. Why not get back on track with another big performance here in week 4? Moving on to our number 16, it is James Conner. Listen, James Conner was in that questionable tag this past weekend. And though we didn't know if he was going to play up until, pregame warmups, my goodness, this guy was hobbled with an ankle injury the week before, then comes out and has himself 18 opportunities and 16 total touches in this game. And though his overall fantasy point contribution of 7.2 points isn't enough, we're anticipating that he needs to score touchdowns to be relevant. We know that. But overall, in terms of James Conner and the opportunities that he's getting, even when he's injured, that gives me enough confidence to continue to start him within my offense going forward. The Carolina Panthers defense, they've struggled. Just this last weekend, of course, Alvin Kamara, outside of that fumble he had, was having a pretty good game. We saw Mark Ingram cap it off at the end of the drive, be able to score a rushing touchdown. You even go back, to week 1, there are a lot of teams that have put up points against them. Nick Chubb, Kareem Hunt, those running backs ran through this Carolina Panthers defense. There's a lot of potential here for James Conner to, of course, get incorporation on the ground, opportunity through the air, and if that goal line upside's there, I expect him to be my number 16 overall back. Moving on to Cordarrelle Patterson, number 17. Cordarrelle Patterson continues to surprise me. Like, just when I think, man, Cordarrelle Patterson has shown us his best, and yes, he's going to be good, but he won't be as good, he continues to surprise me. He's coming off of a game in which he had his career high in rushing yards, 141 against Seattle on 17 rushing attempts, an 8.29 yard per carry average. That in itself is unbelievable. I mean, thus far this season, on average, he's averaging 6.16 yards per carry on the ground. He's not getting any utilization through the air, but it doesn't matter. He has the 9th most rushing attempts amongst all running backs in the league thus far. And as long as he's going to be playing majority of the snaps, getting majority of the rushing attempts, and in a relatively favorable matchup against the Cleveland Browns, who may not have Jadeveon Clowney and Myles Garrett going into this upcoming weekend's matchup, my goodness, Cordarrelle Patterson, fantastic position to succeed. Moving on to Javonte Williams. I understand that many of you may be upset about Javonte Williams' performance on Sunday Night Football against the 49ers, but let's take this into account. He still had himself 15 rushing attempts and 5 targets, 20 overall opportunities, while Melvin Gordon had 18 overall opportunities, sure. But overall, when you're getting a running back 20 opportunities, it doesn't matter what team you're on. It doesn't matter if there's another running back that's relevant in that backfield. All that matters is you're getting the touches and you're able to deliver. Unfortunately, only averaged 3.87 yards per carry and only had himself 2 receiving yards on the 3 receptions that he made. And the lone, overall rushing touchdown that was for this backfield went to Melvin Gordon. That may be bothering you, but understand that the opportunity is going to continue to be there in this offense for Javonte Williams. They're working off the hot hand, and I expect the Las Vegas Raiders matchup, like it was for Derrick Henry getting him back on track, to do the same for Javonte Williams this upcoming week. An incredible matchup in the division where we should see a lot of success. Moving on, we have ourselves Dameon Pierce. Listen, we love Dameon Pierce as a rookie running back coming out of college with very minimal overall opportunities and wear and tear on his body. But now that they're continuing to uptake his overall touches, man, does he look like someone that should have been given more opportunity in college. Pierce accounted for 22 total touches this last week against the Chicago Bears defense, which accounted for 101 total yards and had himself a touchdown. If we're going to continue to see Dameon Pierce utilized at this capacity, we've seen Lovie Smith already gush over him and say, hey, Dameon Pierce works harder than just about anybody in this offense, always fighting for extra yards, playing 60% of the offensive snaps this past Sunday, 17.1 fantasy points. I'm expecting this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Los Angeles Chargers, who have shown that they are a defense that not only gives up a bunch of points to running backs on the ground, but also through the air. This should be a matchup where Dameon Pierce should be able to be in that conversation and compete. If the Los Angeles Chargers look a lot like they did last week, this could be a far closer game, keeps Dameon Pierce in the game script and involved at a capacity of being a top 20 fantasy back. Moving on to Cam Akers. Finally, the switch has been made. It has been fully kind of transitioned, and it's kind of crazy to see, considering the fact that Darrell Henderson and Cam Akers split snaps 50-50. That in itself is quite surprising to me, considering the entire opportunity of touches went purely in the direction of Cam Akers. I think Darrell Henderson had himself 4 rushing attempts, while Cam Akers had himself 12 rushing attempts, 61 rushing yards, a 5.08 yard per carry average, a rushing touchdown, and also fumbled on the 1 yard line. Very easily could have had himself a second touchdown in this contest, which gets Cam Akers to where we anticipated him this offseason in that RB2 conversation. And even if he is going to lose out on snaps, on third downs, on some opportunities here and there to Darrell Henderson, it has already once again been reestablished by head coach Sean McVay that they prefer Cam Akers. We talked about this. There's a reason why they played him for the entirety of the playoffs into that 2021, championship run. It's because they trust him more. And now that we've gotten back to trusting him more, even against this somewhat difficult matchup against the San Francisco 49ers, I expect him to get a lot of utilization, and when he does so, to deliver. Moving on to Josh Jacobs. I was quite surprised to see that Josh Jacobs even played this past weekend, considering the illness where he initially didn't travel with the team. They got on a private flight, then flew over to Tennessee, not only to get there, but to have himself a great overall game. And the thing that keeps me pretty excited about the potential of Josh Jacobs going forward is that the receiving work is beginning to get an influx of opportunity. That was something that wasn't present earlier this season. And even when Brandon Bolden was active this past game, the targets and the receptions were going in the direction of Josh Jacobs. 6 targets, 5 catches, 31 receiving yards. if Josh Jacobs can get himself incorporated in the receiving game, third down work, even second down and long work in that regard, by all means, Josh Jacobs is going to be a relevant back in this offense. 12.2 fantasy points without even scoring a touchdown. Imagine when those touchdowns get involved. The guy was averaging over 5 yards per carry against the Tennessee Titans, but wasn't allowed to run the ball more than 13 times because the game was out of their hands and they had to pass in order to come back. In my opinion, even though this is a tougher matchup against the Denver Broncos, I don't mind that. Because if as long as Josh Jacobs is getting those receiving opportunities, his overall floor of production is relatively high in a half PPR. Let's move on to Ezekiel Elliott. Ezekiel Elliott was able to continue his streak of touchdowns. We mentioned it last week. 7 of the last 8 games that he had played against the New York Giants, he was able to at least get 1 touchdown in those contests. We were hoping that in week 3, he was able to do so. Last night, did exactly that. Got onto the goal line, got himself into the end zone, and continued to command majority of these backfield opportunities in terms of touches and snaps, playing 64% of the snaps, out carrying and out touching specifically Tony Pollard, 16-13. And though Tony Pollard looks like a back that if you really give him all of the opportunity, this guy's a top 5 back in this league. I'm not even kidding. He really looks like that. He is incredible with the opportunities he's given. But as long as Ezekiel Elliott is in this backfield, he's going to get his touches and he's going to get himself an ample amount of fantasy points. 15 carries, 73 rushing yards. Behind a pretty beat up offensive line, it does not matter. They were making rotations in the middle of that game, moving in one left guard and then pulling him out and then swapping the right tackle. Like there were so many different movements there, but it doesn't matter. Ezekiel Elliott, as long as you continue to get these 15 touches per game that you've pretty much been on streak for, we finally saw a huge influx of rushing yardage and that touchdown that got us to the next level. Hopefully we're back on track with Zeke taking on a division rival, the Washington Commanders, who have given up their fair share of points. Moving on to Kareem Hunt. Again, we've mentioned it. Kareem Hunt is going to be a guy that just needs a touchdown to unlock his overall potential. Otherwise, his baseline of yardage, receptions, receiving work overall is going to get him to the conversation of being, an 8-point running back. He gets to the touchdown, 14 points, he's into the top 12 based on what we've seen in the last couple weeks in a half PPR scoring format. That all being said, I do want to remind you guys, for those of you who listened to the conversation regarding Nick Chubb, I did mention that against the Pittsburgh Steelers, Kareem Hunt had 2 rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line. Unfortunately, was not able to cap those off, and then we saw Nick Chubb come into the game and score a touchdown. If in fact one of those touchdowns go in the direction of Kareem Hunt, it makes his week. He's still playing about 44% of the offensive snaps in that range. And as long as he's getting the ample amount of opportunity, 16 total this past week, I think he's in a fantastic position against the Atlanta Falcons to succeed as an RB2. Let's move on to Rashaad Penny. I know you may be thinking, Andrew, how can we trust Rashaad Penny based on what he has already produced for us thus far this season? He has the easiest matchup at the running back position, one of the. Outside of the Houston Texans, the Detroit Lions is the matchup you want to start all of your running backs against. Now, in this specific circumstance, I know it's difficult to do so considering we haven't seen much out of Rashaad Penny, but just put this in perspective. This last week, he played 69% of the offensive snaps, 49 of the total 71. Had himself 7.4 fantasy points, 14 rushing attempts, and 1 reception. 15 touches, almost 70% of the snaps, and honestly played well. He really just needed a touchdown to get him to the next level. And now you take on the Detroit Lions, who he himself has had himself an incredible performance against. You guys remember week 17 of last year? Won many of you fantasy championships where he put up 31.5 fantasy points against that defense. A 5-star matchup, to say the very least. If this team is going to run the ball and continue to limit the opportunities they give Kenneth Walker as of right now, Rashaad Penny could very easily take over in this weekend's game. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about our 13 through 24 rankings with the graphic on screen. Do not forget, rankings are subject to change. We will have updated rankings every Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time on screen for a half PPR scoring format. So if any information is to reveal itself as the week progresses, we will adjust that accordingly and go ahead and set you up for success for Sunday morning. So be sure to check that out. Hopefully you guys appreciate these graphics. Be sure to click the like button down below. I greatly appreciate it. All right, let's get into our RB3 conversation, beginning with our number 25, Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, first and foremost, screams sell high right now. Clyde Edwards had a week just last week where he had 7 rushing attempts, 0 rushing yards on those 7 attempts, and was still managing to get over 12 fantasy points. 5 catches, 5 targets, 39 receiving yards, and a rushing touchdown. Just putting that in perspective. Now he takes on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense, who do not give up anything on the ground, and is going to make his life pretty difficult this week. That all being said, this is more of a PSA of, hey, you should probably start him because he's got a hot hand in terms of the red zone, but expect it to be difficult. And also maybe just go sell high on him so you don't have to even deal with this matchup and get, completely away from Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Maybe even just pick up Jerick McKinnon just in case for future weeks. Moving on to Antonio Gibson, taking on the Dallas Cowboys. Antonio Gibson in the last couple of weeks has been decent. His overall yard per carry average, his utilization in the receiving game has relatively disappeared considering J.D. McKissic's uptick. And once we see Brian Robinson return, whether that is this or the following weeks, I mean, that's obviously going to all go downhill for him. This is another one of these players that you should obviously have sold high on or continue to probably look to try to move him now before it's too late. I think this is a good enough matchup to where, yes, they can get down into the red zone, get him that run, inside the 5-yard line, score a touchdown, get him 10 fantasy points, and he's done. That's what I'm expecting to see. 40 rushing yards, maybe a catch for, 10 yards, and a rushing touchdown at the end of our Week 4 contest. Moving on to Jeff Wilson Jr. taking on the LA Rams defense. Jeff Wilson Jr. is a great running back. He was highly efficient against the Denver Broncos, but the offense as a whole just really was nothing because Jimmy Garoppolo was kind of pulling them down. Nonetheless, I do expect Jeff Wilson Jr. to be a running back that we can trust this week in a flex RB3 capacity. He's not getting enough receiving work, and he's certainly not going to get enough rushing attempts, especially if, in fact, the run-stopping efforts of the LA Rams does make it difficult on the 49ers. But I do want to mention, in the last 7 games that the 49ers have taken on the LA Rams, the 49ers have won 6 of the last 7. The only games that they lost against the Rams was the NFC Championship game last year. So just putting into perspective as to just how close the Rams versus 49ers matchups are, it's typically in the favor of the 49ers. Kyle Shanahan really does know what Sean McVay likes to run and really knows how to stop him. And whether that's offensively, defensively, Jeff Wilson should be in a pretty comfortable position to succeed this week. Moving on to Miles Sanders. Listen, Miles Sanders is in a good position considering he is the, for sure, number 1 back of his team. Getting incredible opportunity. 15 rushing attempts is no joke. But not only does he take on the toughest matchup in terms of, rushing statistics allowed to opposing running backs, and that's relatively all the value that Miles Sanders finds in terms of, yes, he's going to get yardage, but it's only going to be on the ground. No, real opportunity through the air. He also has to split opportunities with Jalen Hurts, which definitely hurts his value. But at least we have confidence because he's behind one of the best offensive lines in the league. And if that's going to continue to be the case, which it will, even in this tough matchup, he is still in that RB3 conversation because the opportunities that he is given could very easily line him up for an opportunity that breaks out for a 70-yard run or could very easily be a 1-yard plunge into the end zone, getting him over that 10 fantasy point hump, which I'm expecting to see this week. Moving on, we have Devin Singletary. Devin Singletary set himself career highs in targets, receptions, and receiving yards. Had himself a receiving touchdown. Devin Singletary played out of his mind against the Miami Dolphins. And even though he wasn't given much opportunity on the ground, this offense really had to look towards their running backs to be, big playmakers. Dawson Knox, Gabriel Davis, they weren't really present factors in that game. Of course, we saw Isaiah McKenzie playing well. We saw a little bit of a situation where Stephon Diggs was cramping, slowing down a little bit. But ultimately, when I think about Devin Singletary's potential, he still got himself 9 rushing attempts for 13 yards. If you are able to just be a little bit more efficient, the offensive line's a little bit more healthy this week in comparison to last week. If he gets anything close in terms of the receiving potential like this number going forward, that would be insane. I doubt that's going to be the case considering Josh Allen had a boatload of passing attempts. Those numbers are going to go down as they'll be far more efficient and won't be as, stressed to score points, but it may very easily be a shootout against Lamar Jackson. He looks like a quarterback right now that is lined up to be the MVP. If this is going to be a boat race, expect Devin Singletary to get a lot of work. Moving on to Breece Hall at number 30. This is the only Jets running back that I'm mentioning on today's video because I expect that transition to take place going forward. I expect Breece Hall to continue to get more and more touches, more and more opportunities every single week. And to be honest, the fact that he outsnapped Michael Carter is huge. Now, the biggest factor going into this upcoming week is whether or not we're going to see Zach Wilson target his running backs in the receiving game. Because Breece Hall had himself 11 targets, 6 catches, 53 receiving yards. And though he is leading amongst the running back position in terms of receiving overall potential, receptions, targets, he's in the top of that category. It may not be sustainable without Joe Flacco under center. That is what concerns me. That's what kind of relatively moves him down the list. He's getting himself pretty efficient work when he's given opportunities, whether it is on the ground or through the air. It's just a matter of whether or not he could take advantage of it with a different quarterback against a Pittsburgh Steelers defense that may be pressuring Zach Wilson a little bit too much this week. Moving on to Rhamondre Stevenson. Listen, I love the Rhamondre Stevenson. Again, you guys probably know this. I've talked about him all offseason, all regular season. My biggest issue is that if, in fact, Mac Jones is not playing, which we're anticipating is going to be the case, considering he's dealing with a severe, quote-unquote, high ankle sprain, we saw the images. He was in pretty immense pain coming off the field, being carried off. But if in fact the running opportunity is lesser, considering the fact that they're in a matchup against Green Bay and Green Bay mounts an early lead, this will lead to Rhamondre Stevenson, whether it is, Brian Hoyer at quarterback, getting a lot of targets, which kind of keeps him in that RB3 conversation, but just not as much potential upside in comparison to when Mac Jones is under center. Moving on to Melvin Gordon. Fantastic matchup, got 18 opportunities this past week, and he got himself a rushing touchdown. If he's going to continue to get himself similar utilization, we should expect him to be in this RB3 conversation as a flex option going forward, especially against the Raiders defense, who really cannot stop opposing running backs and have shown the struggle all season and even last. Moving on to our number 33, we have Tony Pollard. Though he is playing less snaps than Zeke, and though he is far more efficient, eventually there may be a switch where Pollard is going to be the primary back. I don't know when that's going to take place, whether that's this year, whether that's this week, whether that's next year. Only a matter of time. But as of right now, considering his extreme efficiency, he's got to be a potential flex option. We're hoping he gets more receiving work to kind of give us more of a baseline that we can hope to see. But, just this last week, despite the fact that he had over 100 rushing yards, without a touchdown, without, extra receiving work, it is hard for us to trust him to get those kind of numbers every single week. Moving on. Let's talk about our number 34. It is A.J. Dillon. A.J. Dillon hasn't been very efficient with his opportunity in comparison to other running backs who are in this, two running back role. For example, when we talk about Chubb and Hunt, when we talk about, Rhamondre Stevenson in comparison to Damien Harris, when we talk about Tony Pollard in comparison to Zeke, A.J. Dillon, yes, he's getting opportunity, but he's only averaging 3.45 yards per attempt. That, in my opinion, kind of lowers him down in terms of my value going forward. And unless he's scoring a rushing touchdown, a lot of the receiving work is not going to be as hyper efficient for him as it was in week 1 against Minnesota, which, pretty much concerns me to the point where this week, in a tough matchup against the New England Patriots defense, I want to kind of opt away from him and leave him as an RB3. Moving on to J.K. Dobbins. This past week, he was limited, and they're pretty much going to ease him in. I don't know if they're going to once again ease him in, but if in fact the Buffalo Bills defense is healthy and they get their starting defensive lineman back, it's going to be tough to run the ball. And with the fact that Lamar Jackson is looking like an MVP, Lamar Jackson himself is literally outscoring teams just in the touchdowns that he has scored alone, much less entire team offenses that have scored as a total sum. Nonetheless, if we're going to see this team be a pass-heavy attack, and of course Lamar Jackson get a lot of utilization on the ground with his feet, that is going to limit the potential of J.K. Dobbins, but maybe he gets more opportunity going forward. But at this point, we're going to have to wait and see, monitor what his opportunity looks like, then progress in the future. The final player I wanted to mention is Damien Harris. If in fact we don't have Mac Jones out there, it's going to be tougher to start Damien Harris because the rushing opportunities that he is being given may not be there based on the game script alone. Damien Harris is a pretty functioning running back. He's going to get himself a pretty good sum of yards per attempt. It's just if the touchdown upside isn't there, if Mac Jones isn't, able to get them down the field and it's Brian Hoyer struggling against the Green Bay Packers defense, may not be a smart start for this week. All right, let's go ahead. Let's show the final graphic for today's episode, the RB3s for our week 4 running back rankings. All right, now that we've kind of covered this, again, rankings are subject to change. Do not forget that. I want to remind you guys, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe. We are here to help you win championships. And if you're trying to help yourself win, click the subscribe button, click the like button down below. We greatly appreciate that. Tomorrow, we'll talk about the wide receiver position. Be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. Again, like I went over, there's a lot of pick'ems that I ended up winning just this past week in terms of a lot of potential that you can go ahead and involve yourself in, picking higher or lower on a given player statistics, even playing in the Thursday Night Rumble, the overall battle royales throughout the season on Sundays. A lot of fun to be had there. We'll be doing that this upcoming Saturday. If you'd like to join us, we'll be drafting some teams. You can participate, compete against myself. I ended up beating a lot of you guys this last weekend in the drafts that we did. Either way, I appreciate you guys. Check out the link down in the description. Use promo code Andrew today when you sign up and make a first-time deposit. You'll be given a first deposit match up to $100. So again, if you're interested in that, check that out. And until tomorrow, guys, I'll see you. Peace.